In the heart of the Roman Empire, during the earliest years of the Christian Church, there lived a man named Onesimus. His name meant useful, though for much of his life he likely wondered if he would ever be seen as more than property. Onesimus was a servant, bound by law and custom to a household in the city of Colossae, a prosperous trading hub nestled in what is now modern-day Turkey. His master was a man named Philemon, a figure of considerable standing in the community. Philemon was not merely wealthy, he was also a Christian, a leader in the local church, someone whose home had become a gathering place for believers. The Apostle Paul himself knew Philemon personally, regarded him as a beloved friend and fellow worker in spreading the gospel. But something went wrong. Exactly what happened we cannot say with absolute certainty. Ancient sources don't give us the full picture. What we know is this: Onesimus fled. He left Philemon's household under circumstances that carried the weight of guilt. Perhaps he had taken something that didn't belong to him. Perhaps he had committed some offence that he feared would result in severe punishment. Perhaps he had simply refused to continue serving under conditions he found unbearable. Roman law was brutally clear on such matters. A runaway servant could face severe punishment, torture, branding, or even execution if captured and returned to their master. So Onesimus ran. He left behind the relative security of a household, the routines of daily life, the people who knew his face and his history. He stepped into a world that was vast, dangerous, and indifferent to the plight of a single fugitive servant. For a man of his social standing, running away was not an act of youthful rebellion or romantic adventure. It was the choice of someone who saw no other path forward, someone who believed that the risk of the unknown was preferable to the certainty of what awaited him if he stayed. Where did he go? The historical evidence suggests that Onesimus made his way to Rome, the sprawling capital of the empire, a place where a man could disappear into the masses. Rome was a city of over 1 million people at that time, a chaotic blend of extreme wealth and desperate poverty, absolute power and complete anonymity. If you wanted to vanish, if you wanted to become invisible, Rome was the place to do it. The city swallowed people whole, absorbed them into its teeming streets and crowded tenements, offered them a kind of freedom that was really just another form of bondage. But anonymity does not erase guilt, and fleeing does not resolve the questions that follow you like shadows. Onesimus carried his past with him wherever he went. Every face in the crowd could belong to someone who might recognize him. Every official, every soldier, every person of authority could be the one who would drag him back to face justice. His freedom was fragile, built on sand, borrowed time in a world that did not forgive men like him. The journey to Rome would have been arduous. Hundreds of miles on foot, travelling along Roman roads that were marvels of engineering, but also dangerous corridors where bandits operated, and where questions were asked of solitary travellers. Onesimus would have had to be clever, resourceful, constantly vigilant. He would have slept in ditches, begged for food, perhaps worked odd jobs in towns along the way to earn enough to continue. Every interaction carried risk. Every conversation required him to construct a believable story about who he was and where he was going. When he finally reached Rome, the reality of his situation would have set in quickly. The city was massive, yes, but it was also expensive, cruel, and unforgiving. Without connections, without resources, without legal status that protected him, Onesimus would have been vulnerable in ways he had never experienced before. He was one fugitive among thousands, one desperate soul in a sea of desperate souls, all trying to survive in the shadow of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. And yet, in the midst of his flight, in the chaos and fear and uncertainty, something was already stirring. A divine appointment was being arranged, though Onesimus could not have known it. The very thing he was running from would become the doorway to the transformation he never knew he needed. The God he did not yet know was already pursuing him, orchestrating circumstances, moving pieces into place for an encounter that would change everything. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Meeting. Rome was a city of paradoxes. a place where extremes collided and coexisted in ways that defied logic. Marble temples dedicated to gods that no one truly believed in stood beside crumbling tenements where families lived stacked on top of each other in conditions that barely qualified as human. Senators draped in purple-bordered togas walked streets shared by beggars covered in sores. Gladiators trained to kill for entertainment, while philosophers debated the nature of the good life. And in the shadow of imperial power, tucked away in modest quarters scattered throughout the city, some of the most influential figures in the early Christian movement lived under house arrest, continuing their work in chains. One of those figures was Paul the Apostle, once Saul the persecutor, now a prisoner for the sake of the gospel he had once tried to destroy. He was not languishing in a dungeon, chained to a wall in darkness. Roman law allowed certain prisoners, particularly Roman citizens who had appealed to Caesar, to rent private lodgings under guard while they awaited trial. Paul had done just that. From this small space, probably a rented room or modest apartment in one of Rome's insulae, he continued his work with remarkable intensity. He wrote letters that would become scripture. He received visitors from across the empire. He taught anyone who would listen, turning his imprisonment into a platform rather than an obstacle. The guards assigned to watch him heard the gospel. Believers came seeking guidance and encouragement. Even some from Caesar's household, as Paul would later mention in his letters, came to faith through his witness. His imprisonment, rather than silencing him, had given him access to people he would never have reached otherwise. The message was spreading, even from chains. How Onesimus came to meet Paul we do not know exactly. The details are lost to history, buried beneath centuries of silence. Perhaps someone mentioned Paul's name in passing, told Onesimus about a man who spoke of freedom and forgiveness, who offered hope to people society had written off. Perhaps Onesimus, desperate and searching for something he couldn't name, heard that a teacher from the East was living nearby and decided to investigate. Perhaps it was nothing more than chance, though those who believe in providence would say there is no such thing as chance when God is orchestrating events. What we do know is this: Onesimus found himself in Paul's presence. Imagine that moment. Try to picture it with all its emotional weight and historical significance. A runaway servant, guilty and afraid, standing in a small Roman dwelling before one of the most influential voices in early Christianity. Onesimus likely expected judgment, questions that would expose him, perhaps even rejection once his story was known. After all, Paul knew Philemon. They were friends, co-workers in the gospel. If Onesimus revealed who he was and what he had done, wouldn't Paul's loyalty to Philemon compel him to send Onesimus back immediately? Instead, Paul offered something entirely different. He offered the gospel. Paul had a remarkable gift for seeing people not as they were, but as they could become. He had spent years proclaiming a message that cut through the rigid social divisions of the Roman world. A message that declared every person, regardless of status, ethnicity, or past, could be reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. He had written to the churches about a kingdom where there was neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, where the old distinctions that organized and stratified society held no ultimate power. And so, when Onesimus stood before him, carrying the weight of guilt and fear, Paul did not see a fugitive first. He saw a soul, a person created in the image of God, someone for whom Christ had died, someone capable of transformation. Paul began to explain the story of Jesus. Not as a distant historical figure or abstract theological concept, but as someone whose life, death, and resurrection carried immediate personal significance for every human being. He spoke of a God who pursued the lost, who sent his Son into the world not to condemn it but to save it. He described a Saviour who had been rejected by religious leaders, betrayed by his own disciples, beaten beyond recognition, and executed on a Roman cross in the most shameful manner imaginable. But that was not the end of the story. Paul explained that 3 days after Jesus died, he rose from the dead, conquering sin and death, offering forgiveness and eternal life to all who would believe. This resurrection was not just a miracle to be admired from a distance. It was the foundation of a new reality, a new way of being human, a new possibility for relationship with God. Onesimus listened. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he heard words that did not define him primarily by his social status or his failures. Paul spoke of grace, that scandalous concept that forgiveness was offered not as a reward for good behaviour, but as a gift to those who could never earn it. He spoke of transformation, of the Holy Spirit's power to change hearts and remake lives from the inside out. He spoke of a love that did not depend on status or performance or anything external, a love that pursued sinners and outcasts and failures with relentless determination. The message was radical. It contradicted everything the Roman world taught about worth and value. It declared that the least could become the greatest, that the last could be first, that a fugitive servant could stand before God with the same status as a Caesar. And something shifted within Onesimus. It is impossible to capture in words the exact nature of conversion, that mysterious moment when the heart turns, when belief moves from intellectual assent to soul-deep conviction. But whatever happened in that small Roman dwelling, in those conversations between a prisoner and a fugitive, Onesimus emerged from it fundamentally changed. He believed. He accepted the message of Jesus Christ not merely as interesting philosophy, but as truth, as reality, as the most important fact about the universe and his place in it. He became, in the language of the early church, a brother, a member of God's family, an heir of the kingdom, someone whose identity was no longer rooted in his past or his social status, but in his relationship with Jesus Christ. Chapter 3. A changed heart. Onesimus did not leave after his conversion. He stayed. This decision itself was significant. He could have taken the gospel message and moved on, disappearing once again into the anonymity of Rome, carrying his new faith with him wherever he went. But something held him there. Perhaps it was gratitude. Perhaps it was a recognition that he had found something precious, something worth staying for. Perhaps it was the beginning of understanding that transformation is not just a moment, but a process, something that unfolds over time in community with others. In the weeks and months that followed his conversion, Onesimus became an integral part of Paul's daily life. The apostle was aging, his body worn from years of relentless travel, physical hardship, and imprisonment. He needed practical help, and Onesimus provided it. He ran errands through the crowded streets of Rome. He brought food and supplies. He assisted with correspondence, perhaps even writing portions of letters as Paul dictated. He offered companionship to a man who, despite being constantly surrounded by visitors and fellow believers, still experienced the loneliness that comes with being far from home and confined by chains. But it was more than mere service, more than simple assistance. Onesimus had been useful before, at least in name. His very name meant useful, a label that had followed him his entire life. But now, for the first time, he was useful in a way that carried genuine meaning and dignity. He was not serving out of compulsion or fear or the coercion of law. He was serving out of gratitude, out of love, out of a genuine desire to contribute to something greater than himself, to participate in the work of the gospel that had transformed his own life. Paul grew deeply fond of him. The affection between them was real, tangible, the kind of bond that forms between people who have walked through significant moments together. In his letter to Philemon, Paul would later describe Onesimus as my very heart, a phrase that reveals the depth of their connection. This was not the detached relationship between a teacher and a student, or even between a mentor and a protégé. This was genuine affection, the kind that comes from shared struggle, mutual respect, and spiritual kinship. Onesimus learned under Paul's guidance, absorbing not only theology but also the practical realities of ministry in a hostile world. He saw how Paul handled conflict with wisdom and grace. He witnessed how Paul encouraged those who were discouraged, how he strengthened the weak, how he remained steadfast in his convictions even when facing opposition or suffering. He learned that following Christ was not about comfort or ease, but about faithfulness, about maintaining integrity in the face of pressure, about loving people even when it was costly. He discovered the rhythms of Christian community. Believers came and went from Paul's lodging, bringing news from churches across the empire, seeking advice on disputes and questions, delivering financial support. Onesimus saw a network of relationships that transcended social boundaries, that brought together people who would never have associated with each other in the normal course of Roman life. He witnessed wealthy patrons sitting alongside poor labourers, Jews breaking bread with Gentiles, learned philosophers listening to the testimonies of uneducated fishermen, and he discovered something profound about his own identity. He was no longer defined by his past. He had been a runaway, a man marked by failure and shame, someone whose very existence was illegal. But in Christ, he was something new. He was forgiven. He was valued. He was loved. Not because of what he could do or what he could offer, but simply because he belonged to Jesus. This transformation was not merely internal or theoretical. It manifested in tangible ways. Onesimus became loyal, dependable, and devoted. He proved himself to be exactly what his name suggested, useful. But now, usefulness was not imposed upon him from the outside. It flowed naturally from who he had become. It was the expression of a transformed heart rather than the obligation of a subjugated will. Other believers who encountered Onesimus in Paul's company saw the change. They heard his testimony, the story of how he had fled from his master's household and ended up encountering the gospel in Rome. They witnessed his service to Paul, the genuine affection between them, the way Onesimus had become an essential part of the apostles' ministry during this season of imprisonment. Yet even in the midst of this new life, even as Onesimus was growing in faith and finding his place in the Christian community, a shadow remained, a question that had not been answered, an issue that had not been resolved. Legally, Onesimus still belonged to Philemon. Morally, his flight had created a debt that had not been paid. And though he had changed, though he had been transformed by the gospel, the circumstances of his departure from Colossae had not been addressed. Paul knew this, and it troubled him deeply. Chapter 4. The Moral Dilemma. Paul faced a problem that tested the very principles he had spent his life proclaiming. It was not an abstract theological puzzle, but a concrete situation that demanded wisdom, integrity, and courage. On one hand, he had grown to love Onesimus deeply. The young man had become indispensable to him during this difficult season of house arrest in Rome. In many ways, Onesimus had become like a son to Paul, filling some of the relational void created by distance from other beloved co-workers. If Paul had his way, if he consulted only his own preferences and convenience, he would have kept Onesimus with him indefinitely, allowing him to continue serving in the work of the gospel, growing in faith, contributing to the ministry that was happening even from chains. But on the other hand, Paul was deeply committed to integrity. He was not a man who bent rules to suit his preferences or who employed moral flexibility when it served his purposes. He believed that the gospel transformed people from the inside out, but he also believed that transformation included making things right with those we've wronged. Christianity was not an escape from responsibility, but a call to embrace it fully, to face the consequences of our actions, to pursue reconciliation even when it was difficult or costly. And the reality was undeniable. Onesimus legally belonged to Philemon. Under Roman law, a servant who ran away was still the property of their master. The master had the right to recover his property, and anyone who harboured a runaway servant or prevented their return could face legal consequences. If Philemon discovered that Paul was keeping Onesimus in Rome without his permission, it could lead to accusations of theft, create legal complications, and potentially result in scandal that would damage the reputation of the Christian community. Moreover, Paul understood something that went beyond legal technicalities. The relationship between Onesimus and Philemon needed to be addressed. Reconciliation could not happen from a distance. Grace was not merely about God forgiving a person in heaven. It was also about that forgiven person being restored to the community they had wronged on earth. The gospel had vertical and horizontal dimensions, and both mattered. So Paul wrestled with the decision. He prayed about it, considered it from multiple angles, discussed it perhaps with other believers who were part of his inner circle in Rome. The easy path would have been to avoid the issue entirely, to keep Onesimus in Rome and simply hope that distance and time would resolve things. The convenient path would have been to send Onesimus somewhere else, to another city, another ministry context, where the complication of his past would not follow him. But neither of those options aligned with the gospel Paul preached. If Christianity truly had the power to reconcile people to God, then it also had the power to reconcile people to one another. If the gospel could dissolve the ancient divisions between Jew and Gentile, if it could create unity between groups that had been enemies for generations, then it could certainly address the broken relationship between a master and his servant. But the question remained, how? How could Paul ensure that Onesimus would be received back safely? How could he protect this young believer whom he had come to love, while also respecting Philemon's rights and authority? How could he appeal for grace without seeming to dismiss the legitimate concerns about property rights and social order that would have been at the forefront of Philemon's mind? Paul knew Philemon well. He trusted him as a brother in Christ, considered him a genuine believer whose faith had been demonstrated through generous hospitality and love for other Christians. Yet Paul also understood the immense cultural pressure Philemon would face. Roman society gave masters absolute authority over their servants. Even if Philemon was personally inclined toward mercy, the expectations of his peers, the norms of his social class, and the precedent he would set with other servants in his household all pushed toward punishment rather than forgiveness. In Roman culture, a master who failed to punish a runaway servant was seen as weak, as someone who could not maintain proper order and discipline. Other servants would take note. Neighbouring households would observe. The entire social system depended on maintaining clear boundaries and swift consequences for those who violated them. For Philemon to forgive Onesimus would be socially costly, a choice that would likely invite criticism and misunderstanding. Paul understood all of this. He was not naive about the complexity of the situation. But he also believed that the gospel called people to live in ways that contradicted cultural norms when those norms conflicted with kingdom values. He believed that Christians were called to be different, to embody a new ethic, to demonstrate what redeemed relationships looked like, even when it was uncomfortable or countercultural. So Paul made his decision. After prayer and careful thought, after considering all the angles and weighing all the factors, he determined what needed to happen. He would send Onesimus back to Philemon. He would not keep him in Rome or send him somewhere else. He would address the situation directly, honestly, with full transparency, but he would not send Onesimus back alone. He would not simply put him on the road to Colossae with a hope and a prayer. He would equip him with something powerful, something that had the potential to change everything. He would send Onesimus back with a letter, a carefully crafted appeal that would lay out the situation, make the case for grace, and call Philemon to embrace the radical implications of the gospel they both believed. Chapter 5. The Letter of Appeal. Paul sat down to write. His hands, likely scarred and weathered from years of manual labour and hardship, from beatings and shipwrecks and countless miles of travel, held a stylus as he began to compose one of the most personal and theologically significant letters ever included in the New Testament. The letter was addressed to Philemon, but it was also meant to be read in the presence of the church that met in Philemon's home. Paul was making this a public appeal, not because he wanted to embarrass Philemon or pressure him through social coercion, but because he wanted the entire Christian community to witness what grace looked like when applied to concrete situations. He wanted this to be a teaching moment, an opportunity for the church to see the gospel at work in relationship dynamics that reflected the deepest social tensions of their world. He began with warmth and genuine affirmation. This was not manipulation or flattery. Paul truly respected and appreciated Philemon. He greeted him as a beloved friend and fellow worker in the gospel. acknowledging their shared ministry and mutual commitment to Christ. He expressed gratitude for Philemon's faith and love, specifically noting how much encouragement the church had received through his generosity and hospitality. Philemon's house was a gathering place for believers, and his support of the Christian community had been significant and noticed. Paul wanted Philemon to know from the very beginning that he was not being accused or criticised. He was not being painted as the villain in this story. Rather, he was being invited into something greater, being called to demonstrate the very qualities that Paul had just praised him for having. Then, after this foundation of affirmation, Paul introduced the heart of the matter. He mentioned Onesimus, and the way he did it was masterful in its rhetorical strategy. He began not with the offence but with the transformation. Paul explained that Onesimus had become a believer, that he had heard and accepted the gospel, that he had been converted during his time in Rome. Paul used a play on words that would have been immediately apparent to Philemon and to anyone hearing the letter read aloud. Onesimus's name meant useful, and Paul noted that there had been a time when Onesimus was useless to Philemon, but now he was useful both to Philemon and to Paul. It was a gentle but pointed reminder that people can change, that transformation is real, that the same person who once failed to live up to their name could, through the power of the gospel, become exactly what their name suggested they should be. Paul then explained his own internal struggle. He admitted openly that he would have preferred to keep Onesimus with him in Rome. The young man had become dear to him, useful in ministry, a source of comfort during imprisonment. In a sense, Onesimus had been serving Paul on Philemon's behalf, representing Philemon's care and support during Paul's time of need. But despite his strong desire to keep Onesimus close, Paul refused to make that decision without Philemon's consent. This was crucial. Paul was demonstrating respect for Philemon's authority and rights, while simultaneously appealing to him to exercise those rights in a particular way. He was not commanding. He was not pulling rank as an apostle. He was making a request between brothers, between equals in Christ, appealing to Philemon's character and faith rather than to any external authority. And then came the most radical part of the letter, the words that would have stunned anyone listening in that first century context. Paul asked Philemon to receive Onesimus back, not as a servant, but as a brother. He wrote explicitly, no longer as a servant, but more than a servant, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. In Roman society, this was an extraordinary statement. Masters did not view their servants as brothers. The social hierarchy was rigid, carefully maintained, and considered essential to the proper functioning of society. Relationships between different classes were carefully regulated. There were appropriate ways for masters to interact with servants, boundaries that were not to be crossed, distinctions that preserved order and prevented confusion. But Paul was asking Philemon to transcend that hierarchy entirely. He was asking him to see Onesimus through the lens of the gospel, rather than through the lens of Roman social structure. He was calling him to recognize that in Christ, the old categories had been fundamentally disrupted. Yes, there were still practical realities to navigate. Yes, there were legal and social structures that could not simply be ignored. But underneath all of that, at the most fundamental level, Onesimus and Philemon were brothers, equals before God, both recipients of the same grace, both members of the same family. To make the appeal even stronger, to demonstrate the seriousness of his request and his personal investment in this reconciliation, Paul made an extraordinary offer. He told Philemon that if Onesimus had wronged him in any way, if Onesimus owed him anything, Philemon should charge it to Paul's account. Paul was willing to take personal financial responsibility for whatever debt Onesimus might have incurred. This was not a casual gesture or empty rhetoric. In that culture, debts were serious matters. They could result in imprisonment or forced servitude if unpaid. By offering to assume Onesimus's debt, Paul was putting his own reputation and resources on the line. He was embodying the very grace he was asking Philemon to extend, demonstrating what it meant to take someone else's burden upon yourself, to pay a debt you did not owe so that someone else could go free. Some scholars have seen in this offer an echo of the gospel itself, a picture of Christ taking our debt of sin upon himself, paying what we could not pay, setting us free from an obligation we could never fulfill. Whether Paul intended that parallel or not, the gesture was profound and costly. Paul even added a playful touch, noting that he could mention that Philemon owed Paul his very self, presumably referring to the fact that Philemon had come to faith through Paul's ministry. Paul could have called in that debt, could have used it as leverage, but he chose not to. He wanted Philemon's response to be voluntary, motivated by genuine faith and love rather than by obligation or guilt. The letter was a masterpiece of pastoral wisdom and rhetorical skill. It combined affection with urgency, respect with boldness, personal appeal with theological principle. Paul did not minimize the wrong that had been done. He acknowledged it directly. But he also did not allow that wrong to define the future or to limit the possibilities for reconciliation and restoration. He appealed to Philemon's faith, to his track record of love and generosity toward other believers, to his relationship with Paul, and most importantly, to the transformative power of the gospel they both professed to believe. He was essentially saying, you claim to believe that the gospel changes everything, that Christ reconciles enemies, that grace overseals past failures. Now is your opportunity to demonstrate whether that's just beautiful theology or lived reality. And then, in an act that required tremendous courage and demonstrated profound trust, Paul entrusted the letter to Onesimus himself. He placed it in the hands of the very person whose fate it would determine, making Onesimus the messenger of his own appeal for grace. Chapter 6. Redefining relationship. The decision to send Onesimus back with the letter as its bearer was deeply significant. Paul could have sent the letter with Tychicus alone, the trusted co-worker who was already travelling to the region with other correspondents. That would have been safer, less risky, more in keeping with normal procedure. But by placing the letter directly in Onesimus's hands, by making him responsible for delivering his own appeal, Paul was making a powerful statement about transformation and trust. He was declaring that Onesimus was no longer the man who had fled. He was trustworthy. He was capable of bearing this responsibility. He was a brother, not just in theory but in practice, someone who could be entrusted with a mission of critical importance. The very act of giving Onesimus the letter was an affirmation of his change, a public declaration of Paul's confidence in him. But beyond the personal dynamics between Paul, Onesimus and Philemon, something much larger was happening. Paul's letter was challenging the entire social structure of the Roman world, and he was doing it in a characteristically subversive way. In the first century, the institution of what we now call slavery was foundational to the economy and culture of the Mediterranean world. It was not questioned by philosophers or politicians. It was simply the way things were, as natural and inevitable as the rising of the sun. People were born into roles, and those roles determined their value, their opportunities, their relationships, and their place in the cosmic order. The Roman Empire ran on the labour of servants. They worked in households, fields, mines, and workshops. They were teachers, physicians, accountants, and artisans. Some lived in relatively comfortable circumstances with opportunities for education and eventual freedom. Others endured brutal conditions in agricultural estates or underground mines. But regardless of their specific situation, they all shared a common legal status. They were property, not persons in the full sense. They had no rights that their masters were bound to respect. Christianity did not immediately dismantle that system. It could not have done so even if it wanted to. The early church was a tiny minority with no political power, no social leverage, no ability to impose new laws or restructure society. The Christian community consisted largely of ordinary people, many of them servants themselves, scattered across the empire in small gatherings that met in homes. What Christianity did instead was something more subversive, more profound, and ultimately more revolutionary than political activism could have achieved. It redefined relationships from the inside. It planted seeds of a radically different vision of human worth and dignity that would, over centuries, gradually undermine and eventually topple the entire system. Paul's letter to Philemon was a perfect example of this subversive strategy. He was not writing a treatise on abolition. He was not calling for political revolution or social upheaval. He was making a personal appeal grounded in a theological truth that had the potential to transform everything. In Christ, the old categories no longer held ultimate power. A person's worth was not determined by their social status, but by their identity as a child of God. A person's value was not measured by their usefulness or productivity, but by the image of God they bore and the price Christ had paid for them. This was genuinely revolutionary, though the revolution was happening at a level deeper than politics or economics. It was a revolution of identity and relationship, a fundamental reordering of how people understood themselves and each other. Paul had written about this principle in his other letters. To the Galatians, he had declared that in Christ there was neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. This was not to say that these distinctions disappeared entirely or became irrelevant in practical terms. A Jewish believer was still ethnically Jewish. A servant was still legally a servant. But these categories no longer determined ultimate identity or spiritual status before God. In the church, in the gathered community of believers, these distinctions were relativized. They still existed, but they no longer had the power to create separation or hierarchy in terms of worth and dignity. A wealthy master and his servant could both be baptized, both take communion, both pray together, both be called brother. This was scandalous to Roman sensibilities, a violation of proper social order, and Paul was now asking Philemon to live out this radical ethic in the most concrete way possible. He was calling him to see his own runaway servant not through the lens of property rights or social convention, but through the lens of spiritual brotherhood. He was asking him to treat Onesimus not according to what Roman law permitted, but according to what Christian love demanded. This was the gospel at work, not just in individual hearts, but in the structure of relationships. It was not just about believing the right things about God. It was about living out those beliefs in ways that contradicted the values of the surrounding culture. And it was costly. Grace always is. Forgiveness requires sacrifice. Reconciliation demands that someone absorb the loss, release their right to retribution, embrace the risk of being hurt again. Paul's letter placed that burden squarely on Philemon. He had to choose. He could insist on his legal rights. He could punish Onesimus for running away. He could reassert the hierarchy that the world took for granted, that everyone expected him to maintain. Or he could embrace the radical ethic of grace that Paul was proposing. The choice was his alone. Paul had made the appeal, presented the case, offered to absorb the cost, but he could not force the outcome. He could only invite Philemon to participate in something beautiful and difficult, the reconciliation of two people whom the world said could never be equals, the restoration of a relationship that society said had been defined by subordination. If Philemon accepted Paul's appeal, if he received Onesimus as a brother, he would be demonstrating something powerful to the watching world and to the church community, that the gospel was not just words, not just religious sentiment, but a transformative power that could reshape the most fundamental relationships of human society. Chapter 7. The Return Journey. Onesimus stood at a crossroads, both literally and metaphorically. He held in his hands a letter that would determine his future, a carefully rolled scroll that contained words he had heard Paul compose, words that made both his heart soar with hope and sink with anxiety. He knew what the letter said. Paul had not kept its contents secret from him. He had heard the appeal, the careful argumentation, the personal testimonies of affection. He knew that Paul had advocated for him, had offered to take his debt, had called him brother and described him as beloved. But he also knew that the decision ultimately rested with Philemon, and there were no guarantees. The journey from Rome to Colossae was daunting, hundreds of miles across rugged terrain through multiple provinces. It would take weeks, perhaps even months, depending on the route chosen and the weather conditions. Onesimus would travel with Tychicus, a trusted colleague of Paul who was carrying letters to multiple churches in the region, including the church at Colossae and the nearby congregation at Laodicea. The companionship was a comfort, a hedge against the isolation and vulnerability that would have come from travelling alone. Tychicus was an experienced traveller, someone who had journeyed with Paul on previous missionary trips. He knew the roads, knew which towns offered hospitality to Christians, knew how to navigate the various dangers that travellers faced. For Onesimus, having him as a companion provided not just practical assistance, but also emotional support. Tychicus believed in him, trusted him, treated him as an equal despite knowing his background. But companionship could not erase the anxiety that gnawed at Onesimus as they travelled. Each step brought him closer to a reckoning. Each mile covered was a mile closer to facing Philemon, to discovering whether transformation was real enough to overcome social expectation and legal right. What if Philemon refused Paul's appeal? What if the letter was not enough? What if the transformation Paul wrote about was dismissed as irrelevant to the practical realities of maintaining a household and upholding social order? What if Philemon's standing in the community made it impossible for him to show mercy without appearing weak? These questions had no easy answers. They haunted the quiet moments of the journey, the long stretches of walking through countryside and along Roman roads, the evenings in roadside inns or staying with Christian communities along the way. But Onesimus also carried something else with him: faith. He had seen the power of the gospel to change his own heart. He had experienced forgiveness that he did not deserve, grace that made no sense according to the logic of the world he had known. He had watched Paul live out this faith daily, maintaining joy and purpose even in chains, showing kindness to guards and generosity to visitors, embodying the very grace he preached. And he had learned to trust that the same God who had pursued him in his flight, who had orchestrated the improbable meeting with Paul in Rome, who had opened his eyes to see truth he had never imagined, was capable of working in Philemon's heart as well. Faith, he was discovering, meant entrusting outcomes to God rather than trying to control everything through his own effort and anxiety. The road stretched on endlessly. They passed through cities and villages, crossed rivers on Roman bridges that were marvels of engineering, climbed hills that offered views of valleys spread out below. The landscape was both familiar in its general Mediterranean character and foreign in its specific details. Spring was arriving, bringing wildflowers to hillsides and green shoots to vineyards that had appeared dead in winter. As they travelled, Onesimus had time to reflect on everything that had happened. His flight from Colossae felt like it had occurred in another lifetime, to another person. He remembered the fear that had driven him, the desperation that had made running away seem like the only option. He remembered the journey to Rome, the uncertainty of those early days in the capital, the hand-to-mouth existence before he met Paul. And he marvelled at the transformation. He was not the same person who had fled. Something fundamental had shifted within him. Where there had been shame, there was now identity. Where there had been fear, there was now faith. Where there had been a sense of worthlessness, there was now an understanding that he was beloved by God, valuable not because of what he could do, but because of whose he was. The gospel had done that, not through grand gestures or miraculous interventions, but through the patient teaching of Paul, through the welcome of the Christian community in Rome, through the slow work of the Holy Spirit remaking him from the inside out. As he neared Colossae, memories became more specific. He recognized landmarks, hills and streams that were familiar from his years in Philemon's household. The landscape triggered recollections, specific journeys he had made on errands, places he had gone to fetch water or buy goods in the market, roads he had walked countless times without thinking about them. He thought of the household he had left behind, the other servants who had been his companions, the routines of daily work, the rhythm of life in a wealthy Christian home, and he thought of Philemon himself, the man he had served and then betrayed by running away. What was Philemon thinking now? Did he even know that Onesimus was returning? Had word somehow reached him? Or would Onesimus's arrival be a complete surprise? How would he react when he saw the man who had fled standing before him again? Onesimus did not know. He could only move forward, trusting that the same grace that had found him in Rome would be sufficient for whatever lay ahead. Chapter 8. The Moment of Decision. Philemon stood in the courtyard of his home, reading by the fading afternoon light. The household was bustling with activity around him, servants going about their tasks, family members engaged in conversation, the sounds of daily life creating a comfortable backdrop. His home in Colossae was substantial, befitting his status as a man of means and a leader in the Christian community. The house church gathered here regularly, and Philemon took seriously his role as a host and patron of the gospel work in the region. He had been surprised when word came that Tychicus had arrived bringing letters from Paul. It had been some time since he had heard from the apostle directly, though news of Paul's imprisonment in Rome had reached him through various channels. The Christian network was remarkably effective at transmitting information, even across vast distances, with travellers carrying news and letters from community to community. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw when Tychicus entered his courtyard. Walking beside the trusted messenger was a face he had not expected to see again. Onesimus. For a moment, Philemon simply stared. The shock was profound. Onesimus, the servant who had run away months earlier, the man Philemon had assumed was lost forever, possibly dead in some distant city, was standing before him. Not in chains, not dragged back by slave catchers, but walking freely, accompanying one of Paul's colleagues. Tychicus explained quickly. Onesimus had become a believer in Rome. He had encountered Paul and been converted, and Paul had sent him back with a personal letter for Philemon. Philemon took the scroll with hands that were not entirely steady. He broke the seal and began to read, aware that members of his household were watching, that other believers who happened to be present were observing this unfolding drama. Paul's voice came through the written words, warm and familiar. The greeting affirmed Philemon, praised his faith and love, expressed gratitude for his ministry. Philemon felt some of the initial shock beginning to settle as he read Paul's characteristic style, the way the apostle combined affection with purposeful communication. Then Paul got to the point. He spoke of Onesimus, and the way he framed it immediately shifted how Philemon was thinking about the situation. Paul did not begin with the offence, with the fact of Onesimus running away. He began with the transformation. He explained that Onesimus had become a believer, had been useful to Paul during his imprisonment, had become beloved. Philemon paused at that word, beloved. Paul was using language of affection and family, describing a servant in terms that broke through the normal categories of Roman social structure. He continued reading. Paul acknowledged his own desire to keep Onesimus in Rome, but his refusal to do so without Philemon's permission. He noted the irony of Onesimus's name and his journey from being useless to being genuinely useful. And then came the core of Paul's appeal. Receive him, no longer as a servant, but more than a servant, a beloved brother. Philemon stopped reading for a moment. The words sat heavily in the air. A beloved brother, not merely a returned servant to be dealt with according to law and custom, not just a piece of property that had been recovered, but a brother. He kept reading. Paul offered to take responsibility for any debt Onesimus owed. He gently reminded Philemon of the debt Philemon himself owed to Paul, though Paul did not press the point aggressively. And he expressed confidence that Philemon would do even more than what was being asked. Philemon finished reading and rolled up the scroll. The courtyard was silent. Everyone was watching him, waiting to see how he would respond. The moment felt weighted with significance that went beyond just this one situation. His response would say something about what he truly believed about the gospel he professed. He looked at Onesimus. The young man stood quietly, eyes lowered in an appropriate posture of respect and humility. But there was something different about him, a dignity that had not been there before, a sense of identity that transcended his social position. Philemon could see the transformation Paul had written about. This was not the same person who had fled. But transformation did not erase the facts. Onesimus had run away. Depending on what exactly had happened, he might have taken things that did not belong to him. His flight had caused disruption in the household, had potentially emboldened other servants to consider rebellion, had violated the trust that was supposed to exist even in the hierarchical relationship between master and servant. Under Roman law, Philemon had every right to punish him. The legal system was entirely on his side. Cultural expectation supported him. No one would blame him for asserting his authority, for making an example of Onesimus to maintain order in his household, and to send a clear message about the consequences of running away. But Philemon was not just a Roman citizen navigating Roman law. He was a follower of Jesus Christ. He believed in a gospel that proclaimed forgiveness, grace, and reconciliation. He had experienced that forgiveness himself, had been transformed by an encounter with Jesus that had reordered his entire life. He led a community of believers who gathered in his home to worship a God who had shown mercy to sinners, who had reconciled enemies, who had broken down dividing walls of hostility. And now he was being called to live out that gospel in the most concrete way imaginable. Paul was not asking him to simply forgive in his heart while maintaining the status quo. He was asking him to receive Onesimus as a brother, to fundamentally reimagine their relationship, to demonstrate what kingdom ethics looked like when applied to the hierarchical structures of Roman society. The decision was his. Paul had made the appeal, but he could not force the outcome. The church community was watching, but they could not make the choice for him. Onesimus stood before him, transformed but vulnerable, his fate hanging in the balance. Philemon thought about everything he had heard Paul teach over the years. He thought about the times Paul had spoken about grace, about how no one deserved forgiveness but God gave it freely. He thought about the example of Christ, who had every right to judge humanity, but instead chose to take the punishment upon himself. He thought about his own story, how he had been far from God and been brought near through no merit of his own. And he thought about what it would mean to show mercy here, in this moment, with witnesses watching and social expectations pressing down on him. It would be costly. It would likely invite criticism. Some would see it as weakness. Others would question whether he could maintain proper order in his household. But it would also be true. It would be consistent with what he claimed to believe. It would demonstrate that the gospel was not just beautiful theology, but lived reality. Philemon looked at Onesimus again, and then he made his choice. Chapter 9. Redemption. Realized history does not give us a transcript of what Philemon said in that moment. The New Testament does not record his exact words or describe the scene in detail. The book of Philemon ends with Paul's appeal, leaving the outcome unstated, trusting that the letter itself would be evidence enough that something significant happened. But the fact that this letter was preserved, that it was cherished by the early church and eventually included in the canon of Scripture tells us something. It suggests that the outcome was positive, that Philemon responded in a way that made this story worth remembering and telling. Early Christian tradition strongly supports this conclusion. The church fathers who wrote about Onesimus in the centuries after Paul's death consistently portrayed him as someone who was not only forgiven, but who went on to significant ministry. They spoke of him as a beloved figure in the early church, someone whose story became an encouragement to countless believers facing their own struggles with guilt, shame, and the possibility of redemption. So while we do not have a detailed account, we can reasonably conclude that Philemon chose grace. He forgave Onesimus. He welcomed him back not as property that had been recovered, but as a brother who had been restored. He embraced the radical appeal Paul had made, and in doing so lived out the gospel in a way that defied the norms of his society. The transformation was complete. Onesimus, the runaway servant whose very name had been a cruel irony, had become truly useful. Not because he was forced into service, but because he had been remade from the inside out. The man whose identity had been defined by his social status, by his legal relationship to a master, had become someone whose primary identity was as a child of God, a brother in Christ, a person of inherent dignity and worth. But the story does not end with his restoration to Philemon's household. This was not the conclusion of Onesimus's journey, but rather a new beginning. Early Christian tradition, particularly the writings of Ignatius of Antioch in the early 2nd century, suggests that Onesimus went on to become a leader in the church. Some scholars have identified him as the bishop of Ephesus, one of the most important cities in the ancient world, and a major centre of Christian activity. Whether or not this specific identification is accurate, the trajectory is clear. Onesimus's life was not defined by his past as a runaway servant. It was defined by his transformation through the gospel. He became someone whose testimony encouraged others. His story became a powerful illustration of what grace could do, how radically God could change a life, how completely forgiveness could restore what had been broken. He lived out the reality that in Christ, old things pass away and all things become new. Imagine Onesimus years later, serving as a church leader, shepherding a congregation, teaching others about the gospel that had transformed his own life. When he spoke about grace, it was not abstract theology, it was his own story. When he urged others to forgive, to show mercy, to see people as more than their worst moments, he spoke from experience. He had been on both sides of that equation, had needed forgiveness desperately, and had received it beyond what he could have imagined. And imagine Philemon, living with the knowledge that his choice to show mercy had allowed this transformation to continue unfolding. His decision to receive Onesimus as a brother rather than punishing him as a runaway had opened a door to a future that neither of them could have predicted. His willingness to embrace the uncomfortable, costly ethic of grace had participated in something beautiful that blessed not just Onesimus, but the entire Christian community that would later benefit from his ministry. The letter Paul wrote to Philemon was preserved by the early church and eventually included in the New Testament canon. It is the shortest of Paul's letters, barely more than a few hundred words in the original Greek. Yet it carries a weight far beyond its length. It is a testament to the power of grace to reshape relationships, to the courage required to forgive, and to the radical nature of the gospel when applied to the concrete realities of human society. Scholars have long marvelled at this letter. It contains no grand theological arguments, no extended exposition of doctrine. It is simply a personal appeal from one Christian to another, asking that grace be extended in a specific situation. Yet in its simplicity lies its power. It demonstrates that the gospel is not just about correct beliefs or religious rituals. It is about how we treat each other, how we navigate conflict and hurt, how we embody the grace we have received in our relationships with others. The letter also reveals Paul's pastoral wisdom and his understanding of how transformation happens in communities. He did not command Philemon to forgive. He did not pull rank as an apostle or threaten punishment if his request was not granted. Instead, he appealed to Philemon's faith, to his love for other believers, to his identity as someone who had himself received grace. He trusted that the gospel, properly understood and genuinely embraced, would lead Philemon to the right choice, and he was right. The gospel proved powerful enough to reconcile a master and a servant, to transform a broken relationship into brotherhood, to demonstrate that in Christ, the old social categories no longer had ultimate authority. Epilogue: the gospel that changes status. The story of Onesimus is not just about one man's journey from servitude to spiritual freedom, from shame to restoration, from flight to belonging. It is about the nature of the gospel itself and what it means to live as people who have been transformed by grace. Christianity does not merely offer forgiveness in the abstract, as if salvation were just about securing a place in heaven after death. It calls people into a new way of relating to one another, a new social reality that contradicts and ultimately overcomes the divisions and hierarchies that organize human society according to power, wealth, ethnicity, and status. This does not mean that practical realities disappear overnight, or that all social distinctions immediately vanish when someone becomes a Christian. The early church existed within systems of power and oppression that it could not immediately dismantle. Paul himself acknowledged this reality in his letters, counselling believers to remain in whatever situation they were in when they were called, whether slave or free, married or unmarried. But the gospel planted seeds of a different vision, seeds that would gradually grow and eventually transform the entire landscape. It declared that in Christ there was a fundamental equality of spiritual status that transcended social position. It proclaimed that every person, regardless of their place in society's hierarchy, was created in the image of God and was therefore worthy of dignity and respect. It announced that the barriers that divided humanity had been broken down through Christ's death and resurrection, and it called believers to live out this new reality in their relationships with each other, to embody kingdom ethics even while still living in a fallen world, to demonstrate what reconciled community looked like even within structures that remained broken and oppressive. Onesimus' story is a concrete example of this principle in action. It shows what happened when the gospel intersected with one of the most rigid and fundamental social hierarchies of the ancient world. It demonstrates that grace is not just a nice idea, but a transformative power that can actually change relationships, heal brokenness, and create something new out of what seemed permanently ruined. The story also reminds us that transformation is possible for anyone. Onesimus was not a particularly special person by the world's standards. He was a runaway servant, someone who had failed in his responsibilities, someone whose prospects seemed limited at best. Yet he encountered the gospel, responded in faith, and became someone whose life and testimony blessed the church for generations. His story gives hope to anyone who feels defined by their failures, anyone who believes their past disqualifies them from a meaningful future, anyone who has run from their problems only to discover that flight does not solve anything. It declares that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace, that transformation is real, that past mistakes do not determine future identity. The story also challenges us about forgiveness. Philemon's choice to show mercy was costly. It went against cultural expectations, risked his reputation, and potentially created complications in his household. Yet he made that choice because he understood that the gospel demanded it, that you cannot claim to have received grace from God while withholding it from others, that true Christianity shows itself in how we treat people who have wronged us. This remains one of the most difficult aspects of Christian faith. It is relatively easy to believe in God's forgiveness when we are the ones who need it. It is much harder to extend that same forgiveness to others, especially when we have been genuinely hurt, when there are real costs to showing mercy, when forgiveness feels like letting someone off the hook or failing to maintain proper boundaries. Yet the gospel calls us to exactly this kind of costly forgiveness. Jesus taught that we should forgive not 7 times, but 70 times 7, essentially without limit. He told stories about servants who were forgiven massive debts, but then refused to forgive small ones, illustrating the hypocrisy of receiving grace while denying it to others. And he modelled this himself, praying for the forgiveness of those who were crucifying him, even as he hung on the cross. Philemon's decision to forgive Onesimus was an imitation of this divine forgiveness, a living out of gospel principles in the messiest parts of human life. It demonstrated that Christianity was not just about private piety or religious sentiment, but about concrete action, about how we structure our relationships and communities. The story also speaks to the power of reconciliation. Paul could have advised Onesimus to stay in Rome, to start fresh somewhere else, to avoid the pain and risk of facing Philemon again. But he knew that true restoration required reconciliation, that you cannot fully heal from past failures without addressing them honestly and seeking to make things right with those you have wronged. This is countercultural in our modern context as well. We live in a world that often prioritizes self-protection and moving on over the hard work of reconciliation. We are told to cut toxic people out of our lives, to prioritize our own healing, to avoid situations that might reopen old wounds. And while boundaries are sometimes necessary and not all relationships can or should be restored, there is something profound about pursuing reconciliation when it is possible, about facing our past rather than running from it, about seeking restoration rather than settling for avoidance. Onesimus' willingness to return to Colossae to face Philemon To deliver Paul's letter, knowing that his fate hung in the balance, was an act of remarkable courage grounded in faith. He trusted that the gospel was powerful enough to transform not just his own heart, but Philemon's as well, that grace could create something new where there had been only brokenness, and he was right. The reconciliation that occurred between Onesimus and Philemon became a testimony that encouraged the early church and continues to speak to us today. It demonstrates that with God, what seems impossible becomes possible, that relationships that appear permanently broken can be restored, that people can change in ways that defy our expectations. The story of Onesimus reminds us that the gospel is not merely about individual salvation, but about the creation of a new community, a people who relate to each other in radically different ways, because they have all been transformed by the same grace. It shows us that Christianity, properly understood and genuinely lived, has the power to transcend the divisions that separate us, to heal the brokenness that defines so much of human existence, to create spaces where people can belong regardless of their past or their status. This is the heart of the Christian message. Transformation is possible, not just for souls, but for relationships and communities. Reconciliation is real, not just between God and humanity, but between people who have hurt each other. And no matter how far anyone has run, no matter what they have done, the grace of God is always pursuing them, always calling them back, always offering a new beginning. Onesimus's journey began with flight, with a desperate attempt to escape from shame and consequences. It ended with belonging, with a place in God's family and a role in God's mission. And in between, grace rewrote everything, transforming a fugitive into a brother, a failure into a faithful servant, a man defined by shame into someone defined by love. This is what the gospel does. It does not merely forgive sins in some abstract legal sense. It fundamentally remakes people from the inside out, giving them new identities, new purposes, new possibilities. It takes what is broken and makes it beautiful. It takes what is lost and brings it home. It takes lives that seem to have no value and declares them precious beyond measure. The story of Onesimus is not just his story. It is the story of every person who has ever been lost and then found, who has ever been broken and then restored, who has ever been defined by failure and then redefined by grace. It is a story that continues to unfold today in every life that is touched by the gospel, in every relationship that is healed, in every heart that is transformed by encountering the love of God. Because the same grace that found Onesimus in his flight, that pursued him across hundreds of miles, that orchestrated his encounter with Paul in Rome, that transformed him from a fugitive into a beloved brother, that restored him to Philemon's household not as property but as family, that launched him into ministry that would bless countless others, is still at work today, still pursuing, still transforming, still reconciling, still restoring, still rewriting lives that seem defined by past mistakes, still creating beauty out of ashes, still bringing hope to the hopeless and belonging to the lost. That grace is offered freely to anyone who is willing to receive it, to anyone who is tired of running, to anyone who longs for transformation, to anyone who wants to discover that their identity is not found in their past or their status or their achievements, but in the love of God revealed in Jesus Christ. This is the gospel that changed Onesimus. This is the gospel that calls each of us today. And this is the gospel that has the power to change everything, if only we are willing to believe it and to live as people who have truly been transformed by grace. The story of Onesimus reminds us that no one is beyond redemption, that transformation is always possible, that grace is more powerful than guilt, that love is stronger than law, and that the God who created us continues to pursue us, calling us home, offering us new beginnings, inviting us into a story far greater than anything we could write for ourselves. This is the truth at the heart of the Christian faith. We are all Onesimus, fugitives running from our past, carrying shame and guilt, wondering if we could ever be accepted or valued. And the gospel meets us in our flight, transforms us through grace, restores us to community, and gives us new identities as beloved children of God. This is the story that has been told for 2,000 years. This is the story that continues to unfold in countless lives around the world. And this is the story that invites you, whoever you are, whatever you have done, wherever you have run, to come home and discover that grace is real, transformation is possible, and you are loved beyond measure. True faith is not proven in comfort, but in pressure. It's easy to worship when worship is celebrated, easy to pray when prayer is protected, easy to believe when belief comes with applause and approval. But what happens when faith is met with silence, with suspicion, with punishment? The story of Daniel is not just ancient history, it's a mirror, a question posed across millennia. What do you do when faithfulness becomes dangerous? This is a story set in a foreign empire, under unfamiliar laws, where quiet personal devotion drew the attention of the most powerful men in the world. Where remaining faithful meant risking everything. Where one man's refusal to hide his prayers would lead him into a den of lions and reveal something far greater than survival. It's a story about what faith looks like when tested, not by doubt, but by decree. Faith is often misunderstood. People imagine it as a feeling, a warm certainty that everything will work out, a guarantee of protection, a shield against suffering. But that's not what faith is. Not really. Faith is what remains when the feelings fade, when the guarantees disappear, when the shield is stripped away and all that's left is a choice. Will you still believe? Will you still obey? Will you still pray? Daniel's story forces us to confront that question, because his faith wasn't tested in a moment of spiritual ecstasy. It was tested in the cold machinery of political power, in the ruthless calculations of ambitious men, in a law that made devotion a capital offence. And yet, he prayed. Not because he was foolish, not because he didn't understand the danger, but because he understood something deeper, something that transcends empires and edicts and even lions. He understood that faithfulness is not measured by outcomes, it's measured by obedience, and that the God he served was worthy of trust, even when trust looked like walking into death. This is the story of a man who would not bend, and the God who would not abandon him. Chapter 1. A captive who rose to honour. Daniel was not born in Babylon. He was taken there. As a young man, he had been torn from Jerusalem during the conquest of Judah. The Babylonian Empire had swept through his homeland like a storm, crushing resistance, sacking the temple, and carrying away the brightest and best of Israel's youth. Daniel was among them, young, educated, from a noble family. He was dragged into captivity not as a criminal, but as a prize. The year was around 605 before the Common Era. King Nebuchadnezzar had laid siege to Jerusalem, and the city had fallen. The treasures of the temple were plundered. The sacred vessels were carried off to the house of Nebuchadnezzar's gods. And the young men of noble birth were selected for a different kind of conquest, cultural assimilation. Daniel and his companions were to be educated in the language and literature of the Babylonians. They were to eat the king's food, drink the king's wine, and be transformed into servants of a pagan empire. The goal was clear: strip away their identity, replace their loyalty, and turn them into Babylonians. But exile did not break Daniel. It refined him. From the very beginning he made choices, small choices that revealed the depth of his character. When offered the king's rich food and wine, Daniel politely refused, not out of ingratitude, but out of faithfulness. The food had been offered to idols. To consume it would be to participate, even indirectly, in pagan worship. So Daniel requested vegetables and water instead. It was a small act of defiance, quiet, respectful, but unmistakable, and God honoured it. Daniel and his friends thrived on their simple diet. They grew stronger, healthier, wiser than all the other young men in the king's service. This became Daniel's pattern. While others adapted by abandoning their heritage, Daniel held on. While some forgot the God of their fathers, Daniel remembered. In a foreign land, under foreign rule, surrounded by foreign gods, Daniel remained faithful. And that faithfulness, paradoxically, became his greatest strength. He was educated in the ways of Babylon. He learned their language, their literature, their customs. He mastered astronomy, mathematics, law, and administration. He became fluent in the complex bureaucracy of empire. He understood how power worked, how decisions were made, how kingdoms rose and fell. But he never forgot who he was. He never forgot where he came from. And he never forgot the God who had called his people out of Egypt, led them through the wilderness, and established them in the promised land. Even though that land was now under occupation, even though the temple was destroyed, even though his people were scattered, Daniel served in the court of kings, and he did so with such wisdom, such integrity, such undeniable excellence that even pagan rulers could not ignore him. When King Nebuchadnezzar had troubling dreams, it was Daniel who interpreted them. When the king saw a mysterious hand writing on the wall during a feast, it was Daniel who read the message and explained its meaning. When rulers needed counsel, they turned to Daniel, not because he was politically cunning, but because he was honest. Not because he told them what they wanted to hear, but because he told them the truth. King Nebuchadnezzar had trusted him. King Belshazzar had summoned him in desperation. And now, under the rule of the Medes and Persians, Daniel continued to serve. Decades had passed since his capture. His hair had greyed. His body had aged. He had outlived kings, outlasted empires, survived revolutions, but his spirit, his devotion to God, remained as sharp as ever. He was not a priest. He was not a prophet in the traditional sense. He was a government official, an administrator, a man who handled budgets, policies, and politics, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of imperial bureaucracy. And yet, in the middle of that secular world, his faith never wavered. He prayed 3 times a day, every day, windows open, facing Jerusalem, kneeling before the God who had never abandoned him, even in exile. It was a discipline he had maintained for decades, in youth and in old age, in favour and in obscurity, in safety and in danger. Prayer was not something Daniel did when he felt like it. It was not a hobby or a habit he picked up when convenient. It was the rhythm of his life, the foundation of his identity, the source of his strength. Every morning, every afternoon, every evening, Daniel would stop whatever he was doing, go to his room, open the windows toward Jerusalem and pray. He thanked God for his faithfulness. He asked for wisdom. He interceded for his people. He worshipped. He remembered. And it was this discipline, this quiet, consistent devotion that would soon place him in the crosshairs of envy. Because in the palace, Daniel was not alone. He was surrounded by officials, administrators, governors, and nobles. Men who had been born into privilege, men who had wealth, status, and connections. Men who understood how the game of power was played, and they were about to discover that Daniel was unbeatable, not because he played the game better than them, but because he refused to play it at all. Chapter 2. The New King's Favour. When Darius the Mede took control of Babylon, The empire was in transition. The Babylonian dynasty had fallen. The night of Belshazzar's feast, the night of the writing on the wall, had ended with conquest. The armies of the Medes and Persians had entered the city, and the throne had changed hands. Darius was a strategic king. He understood that ruling a vast empire required more than military might. It required organisation, delegation, oversight, and most of all, trust. The Persian Empire was enormous. It stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing dozens of nations, languages, and cultures. Governing such a territory required a sophisticated administrative structure. So Darius restructured the government. He divided the empire into provinces, each overseen by a satrap, a regional governor with significant authority. He appointed 120 satraps to rule over different regions. But to keep them accountable, to prevent corruption and rebellion, Darius placed 3 high officials above them. These 3 would oversee the satraps, report directly to the king, and ensure that the empire ran smoothly. And among those 3, Daniel stood out. It wasn't favoritism, it was merit. Daniel had proven himself time and again, across multiple administrations, under multiple kings. His decisions were sound, his judgment was clear, his integrity was unshakable. He didn't scheme for power, he didn't play favourites, he didn't take bribes or bend the truth to suit political wins. While others manoeuvred and manipulated, Daniel simply worked. Faithfully, excellently, without compromise, King Darius noticed. In meetings, Daniel's counsel was the most reliable. In crises, Daniel's solutions were the most effective. In disputes, Daniel's judgments were the most fair. There was a steadiness about him, a wisdom that transcended political calculation, an honesty that made him trustworthy even in a world built on deception. Darius began to consider something bold, elevating Daniel above all the other officials, making him second only to the king himself, giving him authority over the entire empire. It was an extraordinary honour. A Hebrew exile rising to the highest position in a Persian empire, a foreigner trusted above native-born nobles, a man in his 80s being given more power than men half his age, a worshipper of the God of Israel being placed over men who bowed to Ahura Mazda, and a pantheon of other deities. It was unprecedented, and it was dangerous, because honour has a shadow, and that shadow is envy. The other officials watched Daniel's rise with growing resentment. They saw the king's favour. They saw Daniel's influence. They saw the way Darius consulted him, trusted him, relied on him, and they hated it. Not because Daniel was corrupt, but because he wasn't. Not because he played political games, but because he refused to. Not because he was incompetent, but because his competence made them look inadequate by comparison. They were men of status, wealth, and power. They had spent their lives climbing the ladder of influence. They had made the right alliances, said the right things, positioned themselves strategically. And now this foreigner, this exile, this old man who refused to compromise, was about to be elevated above them all. It was intolerable. So they began to plot, quietly at first, carefully. They met in private, away from the king's hearing. They shared their grievances, fueled each other's resentment, and began to strategize. Their goal was clear: destroy Daniel, remove him from power, eliminate the threat he posed to their ambitions. But how? Daniel was beyond reproach. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't break rules. He didn't have skeletons in his closet. There was nothing to exploit, no scandal to uncover, no weakness to leverage. They couldn't beat him fairly, so they decided to destroy him unfairly. And to do that, they would need to use the one thing Daniel would never compromise: his faith. Chapter 3. The Plot Against Prayer. The conspirators gathered in secret. These were not common criminals. They were influential men, powerful men, men whose pride had been bruised by a foreigner's success, men whose ambition had been thwarted by a man who wouldn't play their games. They sat in a private chamber, voices low, plotting the destruction of a righteous man. One of them spoke first. "We've been over his record a dozen times. There's nothing. No bribes, no corruption, no scandals, no mistakes. The man is spotless. Another official leaned back, frustrated. How is that even possible? Everyone has something to hide. Everyone makes deals, cuts corners, looks the other way, but not Daniel. It's like he's carved from stone. He's not stone, a third voice interjected. He's flesh and blood like the rest of us. He has a weakness. We just haven't found it yet. They sat in silence, considering. Then one of them, perhaps the shrewdest of the group, spoke with cold clarity. We will never find any basis for charges against this man unless it has something to do with the law of his God. The room went still. Everyone understood immediately. It was brilliant. Ruthless, but brilliant. Daniel's faith was his defining characteristic. Everyone knew he prayed. Everyone knew he worshipped the God of Israel. Everyone knew he was devout, disciplined, consistent. He prayed 3 times a day, every day, without fail. It was as predictable as the sunrise. And if they could make that faithfulness illegal, even temporarily, they could trap him. The plan began to take shape. They would craft a law that seemed reasonable on the surface but was designed with one target in mind, a law that would appeal to the king's ego while setting a trap for Daniel's faith. One of the officials leaned forward, sketching out the details. We approach the king together, all of us. We present a unified front. We tell him that the advisors, governors and satraps have all agreed on a new decree. What kind of decree? Another asked. A loyalty decree. For 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. We frame it as a way to unify the empire, to strengthen the king's authority during this time of transition. And we make it irrevocable. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, once the king signs it, it cannot be changed, not even by the king himself. The others nodded slowly, seeing the elegance of the trap. 30 days was short enough to seem reasonable. The flattery would appeal to Darius, and the irrevocable nature of Persian law would ensure that once Daniel was caught there would be no escape, no loopholes, no mercy. Daniel will never stop praying, one of them said with certainty. Exactly, the architect of the plan replied. He'll pray, we'll catch him. The king will have no choice but to enforce the law, and Daniel will be thrown to the lions. It was a perfect trap, cruel, calculated, and almost certainly effective. They rehearsed their approach, refining their pitch to the king. They would emphasize unity, loyalty, and the strength of Darius's rule. They would make it sound like a collective decision, not a personal vendetta. They would hide their true motive behind a veil of political wisdom, and then they would wait for Daniel to do exactly what they knew he would do, wait for faithfulness to become a crime, wait for the trap to spring. They left the meeting with smiles on their faces. Daniel's days were numbered, and they had just lit the fuse. Chapter 4. A decree of death. The officials approached King Darius the next day. They came as a group, dozens of them, creating the impression of consensus and unity. They bowed respectfully, their faces arranged in expressions of concern and loyalty. May King Darius live forever, they began, using the traditional greeting. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all consulted together. We have agreed that your majesty should establish a royal decree and enforce it strictly. Darius listened, intrigued. These were his top officials. If they had come to agreement on something, it was worth hearing. One of them continued. We propose that for the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. This will demonstrate the unity of the empire under your rule. It will show that all loyalty, spiritual and temporal, flows through you. Another official added, it will strengthen your authority during this time of transition. The people need to see that the empire is stable, that leadership is clear, that there is one central power they can trust. It was flattery, and it worked. Darius was a capable king, but like all rulers, he was not immune to ego. The idea of being elevated to a position of supreme reverence, even temporarily, was appealing. It seemed like a harmless gesture. 30 days wasn't long. and surely his subjects would have no problem directing their prayers to him for such a brief period. What Darius didn't know, what he couldn't see, was the trap hidden beneath the surface. The officials had carefully avoided mentioning Daniel. They had made it sound like a general decree, not a targeted attack. And Darius, trusting their counsel, saw no reason to refuse. "Very well," the king said. "Draft the decree. I will sign it." The officials moved quickly. They prepared the document with meticulous care, ensuring every word was precise, every clause was clear. The decree stated that for 30 days, no one in the empire could pray to any god or person except King Darius. Violation of this law would result in immediate execution by being thrown into the lion's den. And then they added the critical phrase, "This decree is issued in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked." Darius reviewed the document and signed it. His royal seal was pressed into the wax. The decree became law, irrevocable, absolute, binding even on the king who had issued it. The officials took the signed decree and distributed it throughout the empire. Heralds proclaimed it in the streets. Scribes posted it in public places. Within hours, everyone in Babylon knew, for the next 30 days, all prayers must go through the king. To pray to anyone else, any god, any person, was to invite death. And in his chambers, Daniel heard the news. Chapter 5. The Choice of Obedience. Daniel was in the middle of his afternoon work when the decree reached him. A messenger brought word, reading the proclamation aloud with official formality. Daniel listened carefully, his face calm, his mind sharp. He understood immediately what this meant. This was not a general decree. It was aimed at him. The timing, the specificity, the irrevocable nature, it all pointed to a coordinated effort to destroy him. He knew who was behind it. He could name the officials who had always resented him, who had envied his position, who had waited for an opportunity like this. He understood their strategy. They had crafted a law that would force him to choose between his God and his life. Daniel thanked the messenger and dismissed him. Then he sat alone, considering his options. He could comply with the decree, just for 30 days. It wasn't forever. He could pray silently in his heart where no one could see. He could close his windows, lock his doors, and keep his devotion private. He could survive the 30 days and then return to his normal practices once the decree expired. Many people would have chosen that path, and they would have justified it with reasonable arguments. God knows my heart. He understands. He wouldn't want me to die needlessly. I can serve him better alive than dead. This is just a temporary compromise. It's wisdom, not cowardice. But Daniel didn't see it that way. To him, hiding his faith was the same as denying it, and denying God, even to save his own life, was unthinkable. Prayer, for Daniel, was not just a religious duty. It was communion. It was relationship. It was the lifeline that connected him to the source of all wisdom, strength, and peace. To stop praying, even for a month, would be to cut himself off from the very thing that made him who he was. And there was something else, something deeper. Daniel understood that faithfulness is not proven in comfort. It's proven in pressure. It's easy to worship when worship costs nothing. It's easy to obey when obedience is convenient. But what does faith look like when it comes with a price? When devotion demands sacrifice? When following God means walking into danger? That's when faith is real. That's when it counts. That's when it reveals what's actually in a person's heart. Daniel had lived his entire life with integrity. He had served pagan kings with honesty. He had navigated political intrigue with honour. He had refused to compromise in 1,000 small ways over the course of decades. And now, in what might be the final test of his life, he would not bend. So when the time came for his evening prayer, Daniel did what he had always done. He went to his room, the same room where he had prayed for years, the same room with windows facing west, toward Jerusalem, the same room where he had knelt thousands of times before. He opened the windows, not as an act of defiance, not as a political statement, not to make a point. but because that's what he had always done. Because prayer was not something to be hidden or whispered in secret. Because his relationship with God was not shameful, and he would not treat it as if it were. He knelt down on the floor, his old knees pressing into the familiar stone. He raised his hands, he closed his eyes, and he prayed. He thanked God for his faithfulness, for sustaining him through decades of exile, for granting him favour with kings, for protecting his people even in captivity. He prayed for wisdom, for strength, for the exiles scattered throughout the empire. He prayed for King Darius, that God would guide him. He prayed for his enemies, that God would have mercy on them. And he prayed with peace, not with fear, not with anxiety, not with doubt, but with the calm assurance of someone who had walked with God for so long that trust had become instinct. Outside in the shadows across the courtyard, his enemies watched. They had positioned themselves carefully, where they could see through the open windows without being seen themselves. They had been waiting for this moment, counting on it. And now, as the evening light faded, they saw exactly what they had expected to see. Daniel, on his knees, hands raised, lips moving in prayer, facing Jerusalem, praying to the God of Israel, exactly as they knew he would. The officials exchanged glances. Smiles crept across their faces, silent gestures of satisfaction. They had him. The trap had worked. Now all they had to do was spring it. They watched Daniel finish his prayer, watched him stand slowly, his joints stiff with age, watched him close his eyes for a final moment of silent communion, and then they turned and left, moving quickly through the darkening streets toward the palace. They had a report to make and a righteous man to destroy. Chapter 6. The Arrest. The officials wasted no time. They went directly to King Darius, their voices urgent but controlled, their faces arranged in expressions of righteous concern. They found the king in his private chambers, reviewing documents by lamplight. He looked up as they entered, surprised by the late visit. "Your Majesty," one of them began, bowing deeply. "We come with a matter of great importance, a matter that concerns the law you recently signed." Darius set down his scroll, giving them his full attention. "Go on. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king's brow furrowed slightly. "Yes, I signed that decree. It stands, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." The officials nodded, their trap closing. "That is correct, Your Majesty. The law cannot be repealed, not even by you." Darius waited, sensing something beneath their words. One of the officials stepped forward, his voice carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, we regret to inform you that one of your officials has violated this decree. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day to his God." The words hit Darius like a physical blow. Daniel, his most trusted official, the one man he had planned to elevate above all others, the one man whose counsel he relied on, whose integrity he trusted, whose wisdom he valued above all his other advisors, caught in a trap that Darius himself had signed into law. The king's face went pale, his hands clenched. He looked at the officials, and in their eyes he saw something that made his stomach turn. Satisfaction. They weren't reporting a crime, they were celebrating a victory. Darius realized in that moment what had happened. He had been played, manipulated, used as a weapon against Daniel. The decree had never been about unity or loyalty. It had been about removing the one man who stood in the way of their ambitions, and he, Darius, king of the Medo-Persian Empire, had signed the order himself. "Get out," Darius said quietly, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. The officials hesitated. "Your Majesty, the law must be enforced." "I said get out!" The king's voice rose to a roar. "Leave me, now!" They bowed and withdrew, but their work was done. The trap was sprung, the law was clear, and there was nothing the king could do about it. Darius spent the rest of the day in anguish. He summoned his legal advisors, his counselors, his scholars. He reviewed the law from every angle, searching desperately for a loophole, an exception, a technicality, anything that could save Daniel. But Persian law was absolute. Once a decree was signed and sealed, it could not be altered. Not by circumstances, not by new information, not even by the king who had issued it. The law of the Medes and Persians was designed to be unbreakable, to ensure that royal decrees carried absolute authority. And now that unbreakable law was about to kill the best man in the empire. Darius paced his chambers, his mind racing. Could he delay the execution? Could he reinterpret the law? Could he grant Daniel a pardon? No. The officials returned throughout the day, reminding him of the law. They were relentless, sensing that the king might try to find a way out. Each time they spoke with false respect, but their message was clear. The law must be enforced. Daniel must die. "Remember, your majesty," they said again and again, "according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." As the sun began to set, Darius had exhausted every option. There was no way out. The law was clear, and his own signature had sealed Daniel's fate. With a heart heavier than stone, King Darius gave the order. Daniel was to be arrested and brought to the lion's den immediately. Chapter 7. The Night Among Lions. The lion's den was located on the outskirts of the city, carved into a rocky hillside. It was not a cage or an enclosure. It was a pit, a deep stone chamber accessible only from above. A vertical shaft led down into darkness, and at the bottom the lions waited. These were not ordinary lions. They were kept hungry, trained to be aggressive, used specifically for executions. The den was a place of terror, a final destination for criminals and traitors. No one who entered the pit came out alive. Daniel was brought there under guard as the last light of day faded. A crowd had gathered. Palace officials, curious citizens, people who had heard the news and come to witness the execution of the famous Hebrew. The officials who had orchestrated this stood at the front, barely concealing their triumph. They watched as Daniel was led to the edge of the pit, his hands bound, his face calm. King Darius was there too. He had come himself, unable to stay away, hoping against hope for some last-minute miracle. He looked at Daniel, and his eyes were filled with grief. Daniel met the king's gaze. There was no accusation in his eyes, no bitterness, no resentment, just peace, a deep, unshakable peace, that transcended circumstance. Darius stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." It was all he could offer, a hope, a prayer, a desperate wish that somehow, some way, the God of the Hebrews would intervene where the king could not. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the king's words. Then he was led to the edge of the pit. Ropes were lowered. Daniel was bound to them. And then, slowly, he was lowered into the darkness. The crowd watched in silence as he descended, down through the narrow shaft, past rough stone walls into the blackness below. And then the ropes went slack. He had reached the bottom. From above, those gathered at the edge could hear sounds, movement, low growls, the scrape of claws on stone. The lions had caught his scent. A massive stone, too heavy for any man to move alone, was rolled over the opening of the pit. It settled into place with a hollow thud, sealing Daniel inside. The king's signet ring was pressed into clay and affixed to the stone. The seals of the nobles were added. It was official, legal, irreversible. Daniel was entombed with death itself. And then, silence. The crowd began to disperse. The officials left, satisfied. The guards returned to their posts. But King Darius remained, staring at the sealed stone, his face etched with torment. Finally, his attendants gently urged him back to the palace. He went, but he found no rest there. Darius returned to his chambers, but he could not eat. Servants brought him food, delicacies prepared by the palace chefs, but he waved them away. The thought of eating while Daniel was in the pit made him sick. He dismissed his musicians, his entertainers, his concubines. He wanted no distraction, no comfort, no pleasure. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, tormented by images of what was happening in that dark pit. Was Daniel still alive? Had the lions attacked immediately? Was he suffering? Was he afraid? Or had it already ended? The king could not stop thinking about Daniel's final words. "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Darius had said it as a prayer, but he didn't know if he believed it. Could any god save a man from lions? Could any power overcome the natural order? The night stretched on. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Darius lay awake, listening to the silence of the palace, imagining the sounds in the pit. Growls, roars, screams. But he heard nothing, only silence. And he did not know if that was a good sign or a terrible one. Below the earth, in the darkness of the pit, something extraordinary was happening. Daniel had landed softly on the stone floor. He had expected impact, braced for it, but the descent had been gentle. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he became aware of shapes moving around him. Large shapes, muscular bodies covered in fur, eyes gleaming in the faint light from above. The lions. There were several of them, males and females, powerful creatures, apex predators, capable of tearing a man apart in seconds. Daniel could smell them, the scent of animals, of meat, of danger. He could hear their breathing, the soft pad of their paws on stone. And then he felt something else, a presence, not physical, not visible, but undeniable, as real as the stone beneath him, as certain as his own heartbeat, an angel. Daniel could not see the angel clearly. There was a sense of light, of form, of otherness. But more than that, there was an overwhelming sense of protection, of authority, of divine power that filled the space and held back the natural instincts of the beasts. The lions approached Daniel. They circled him, their breath hot on his skin. They sniffed at him, assessing him, their muscles tense and ready. But they did not attack. They could not. Something held them back. Something closed their mouths. Not metaphorically, literally. The angel of the Lord stood between Daniel and death, and the lions, creatures of instinct and hunger, were rendered harmless. Daniel sat down on the stone floor. His bound hands made it awkward, but he managed. And then he did something that would have seemed insane to any observer. He rested. He leaned back against the wall of the pit. He closed his eyes, and he slept, not fitfully, not anxiously, but peacefully, because he was not alone, because the God he had served for a lifetime had not abandoned him, because even here, in this place of death, divine presence was nearer than fear. The lions settled around him. Some lay down, some continued to pace, but none of them touched him. Throughout the long night, as King Darius lay awake in agony, Daniel rested in the presence of God. And when morning came, the king rose before dawn, unable to wait any longer. Chapter 8. Divine Protection. At the first light of dawn, King Darius was already on his way to the lion's den. He didn't wait for attendants. He didn't summon guards. He went himself, moving through the empty streets with a desperation that bordered on frenzy. He reached the hillside as the sun broke the horizon, casting golden light across the stone. The sealed entrance stood before him, undisturbed. The clay seals were intact. No one had tampered with it. Darius approached slowly, his heart pounding. His mind was filled with dread. He expected to find silence, death, the awful confirmation that Daniel was gone. But he had to know. He had to see. Even if it meant confronting the worst, he owed Daniel that much. The king stood at the edge of the pit and called out. His voice cracked with emotion. "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" For a moment there was nothing, only silence. The kind of silence that crushes hope, the kind that confirms every fear. Darius felt his knees weaken. He had been a fool to hope, a fool to believe, a fool to think that, and then a voice, clear, calm, alive. "May the king live forever," Darius gasped. His hands flew to the stone, gripping the rough surface as if to steady himself. "Daniel! Daniel!" "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Tears streamed down Darius's face. He shouted orders to the guards who had followed him. "Lift him out! Get him out now! Break the seals! Move the stone!" The guards rushed forward. They broke the clay seals, destroying the official markings. They strained against the massive stone, pushing it aside with great effort. The opening was revealed, and ropes were quickly lowered into the darkness. Daniel grabbed hold of the ropes and they pulled him up. Slowly, carefully, he emerged from the pit, rising from death itself. When he reached the surface, Darius rushed to him. The king examined him closely, searching for injuries. Blood, wounds, anything that would indicate the horrors of the night. But there was nothing. Not a scratch, not a bruise, not a torn garment. Daniel stood before him as if he had spent the night in his own bed, not in a pit of predators. His clothes were intact, his breathing was steady, his eyes were clear. He looked rested, at peace, unharmed. It was impossible, and yet undeniable. The guards peered down into the pit, and what they saw confirmed the miracle. The lions were there, prowling, agitated now, their hunger evident. These were not tame animals, they were killers, and yet for an entire night they had not touched Daniel. Darius embraced Daniel, weeping openly. "I thought I had lost you. I thought." His voice failed him. Daniel placed a hand on the king's shoulder. "God is faithful, your majesty. He has always been faithful, even here." The king stepped back, looking at Daniel with a mixture of awe and wonder. "Your God. He did this. He saved you." "Yes," Daniel said simply. "He sent his angel. The angel shut the mouths of the lions." Darius turned to the guards, his grief transforming into rage. "Bring them to me. All of them. Every official who brought charges against Daniel. Bring them here. Now." The officials were found in the city, some still celebrating what they thought was their victory. They were dragged from their homes, their faces confused at first, then horrified as they saw Daniel standing alive beside the king. Darius looked at them with cold fury. "You sought to destroy a righteous man. You used my authority to commit murder. You manipulated the law and manipulated me. You will face the fate you intended for him." The conspirators began to protest, to plead, to make excuses. But Darius silenced them with a gesture. "You wanted the lion's den, you will have it." The officials were seized, not just them, but their families as well. In the justice system of the ancient world, the guilt of a traitor often extended to his household. It was brutal, it was harsh. But it was the law. They were brought to the edge of the pit, and one by one they were thrown in. This time, there was no angel. This time, the lions were not restrained. The Bible records it plainly. Before they even reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them. The same beasts that had ignored Daniel for an entire night fell upon the conspirators with savage speed. There was no mercy, no delay, only swift, terrible justice. The sounds that came from the pit were awful and brief. Within moments, it was over. Darius turned away, his expression grim. He felt no satisfaction in their deaths, only a deep weariness, a recognition that evil, left unchecked, destroys itself. But there was something else, something that stirred in the king's heart, a recognition of power beyond human understanding, a glimpse of something divine. He turned to Daniel. "Your God. Tell me about him." And Daniel did. Chapter 9. A Decree of Truth King. Darius returned to his palace, but he could not rest. The events of the past day had shaken him to his core. He had witnessed something that defied explanation, something that challenged everything he thought he understood about the world, about power, about the gods. He had seen a man survive the unsurvivable. He had seen beasts tamed by invisible authority. He had seen faith vindicated in the most dramatic way imaginable, and it had changed him. Darius summoned his scribes. "I want to issue a decree, not a law that can be manipulated or twisted, a declaration of truth, something that will reach every corner of the empire." The scribes prepared their materials, waiting for the king's words. Darius paced as he spoke, his voice filled with conviction. "Write this: to all peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land, may you prosper greatly." The scribes wrote quickly, capturing every word. "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel." The scribes paused, surprised, but Darius continued, his voice gaining strength. "For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." It was an extraordinary proclamation, a pagan king publicly honouring the God of Israel, not because of political pressure, not because of tradition, but because he had seen the evidence with his own eyes. The decree was copied and distributed throughout the empire. From India to Ethiopia, across 127 provinces, the message went out. Not a command to worship exclusively, not a forced conversion, but a recognition, an acknowledgement, a testimony. The God of Daniel was real, and he was worthy of reverence. In Jewish communities scattered throughout the empire, the news was received with tears of joy. For decades they had lived as exiles, their faith marginalized, their God dismissed as the deity of a conquered people. But now the most powerful king on earth had declared that their God was the living God, that his kingdom would never end. It was vindication, not just for Daniel, but for all of them. And Daniel simply continued doing what he had always done. He served faithfully. He prayed consistently. He honored God quietly. His position was not only restored, it was elevated. The king's trust in him deepened beyond measure. His influence grew. His reputation spread far beyond the borders of Persia, carried by the story of the night he spent among lions and walked out unharmed. But Daniel did not boast. He did not write memoirs or seek fame or leverage his miraculous survival for political gain. He remained the same man he had always been, humble, faithful, devoted. Years passed. Daniel continued to serve under Darius and later under Cyrus the Persian. He witnessed the decree that allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. He saw the beginning of the fulfillment of prophecies he had prayed over for decades, and through it all he remained a man of prayer, 3 times a day, every day, windows open, facing Jerusalem, kneeling before the God who had never abandoned him. His faith had been tested in the most extreme way imaginable, and it had held. Not because Daniel was special, but because the God he served was faithful. The lion's den had been meant to silence him. Instead, it became a pulpit, a testimony that would echo through generations, proof that no empire, no decree, no threat could separate a faithful soul from the God they serve. Chapter 10. Legacy of Faithfulness. The story of Daniel and the lion's den would be told and retold for thousands of years. It would inspire countless believers facing persecution, pressure, and impossible choices. It would become a symbol of what faith looks like when tested by fire, or in this case, by fangs. But what made Daniel's story so powerful was not just the miracle, it was the man. Daniel didn't become faithful the night he was thrown into the den. He had been faithful every day before that, for decades, in obscurity and in prominence, when it was easy and when it was hard. His faith was not reactive, it was rooted. He had established patterns of devotion long before they became costly. He had built a life around prayer, not because he anticipated a crisis, but because prayer was the foundation of his relationship with God. When the test came, he didn't have to decide what kind of man he would be. He already knew. He had decided years before, in 1,000 small daily choices. That's the real lesson of Daniel's story. Faithfulness is not forged in the moment of crisis. It's forged in the moments no one sees, in the quiet mornings and evenings, in the daily discipline of showing up, kneeling down, and praying even when you don't feel like it, even when no one is watching, even when it seems like it doesn't matter, because those unseen moments, those private acts of devotion, are what carry you through when faithfulness becomes costly. Daniel's enemies knew this about him. They knew he would never stop praying because prayer was not a habit for Daniel. It was who he was. It was as essential to him as breathing. To ask Daniel to stop praying was to ask him to stop being Daniel, and that's what made him dangerous to them. Not his intelligence, though he was brilliant. Not his influence, though he had plenty. But his integrity, his consistency, his refusal to compromise. In a world built on negotiation and political manoeuvring, Daniel was immovable. And immovable men are threatening to those whose power depends on everyone playing along. But to God, Daniel's faithfulness was precious. It was the kind of devotion that moves heaven. Not loud devotion, not showy devotion, but consistent, costly, quiet devotion. The kind that says, I will worship you whether you rescue me or not. Whether it's safe or dangerous. Whether people applaud or condemn. That's the kind of faith that shuts the mouths of lions. After Daniel's miraculous survival, his influence in the Persian court only grew. But more importantly, his testimony reached far beyond the palace. Jews throughout the empire heard the story and were encouraged. Their God had not forgotten them. Their faith was not foolish. Even in exile, even under foreign rule, God was still sovereign. Daniel's story also reached future generations. When Jewish children heard about the lion's den, they learned that God could be trusted in the darkest circumstances. When young believers faced persecution in the early church, they remembered Daniel and took courage. When reformers stood against corrupt institutions, when missionaries entered hostile territories, when ordinary believers faced pressure to deny their faith, they remembered the old man who refused to stop praying. Daniel became a symbol, but he would have hated that. He never wanted to be a symbol. He just wanted to be faithful, and in being faithful he became more than a symbol. He became a testimony, living proof that God honours those who honour him, that faithfulness is never wasted, even when it looks like it will cost everything. Epilogue: courage in quiet devotion. The story of Daniel is not just about lions, it's about choices. Small, quiet, daily choices that define who we are when the cost of faithfulness rises. Faith is built in the ordinary moments, in the decision to pray when you're tired, to worship when you're discouraged, to trust when circumstances scream that trust is foolish. These are the moments that matter. These are the moments that prepare you for the test you can't predict. Daniel didn't suddenly become a man of faith when the decree was signed. He had been that man for 80 years, through exile, through service to pagan kings, through the rise and fall of empires. His faith was tested constantly in small ways and large ways, and each time he chose faithfulness. When he was a young man, he chose to honour God's dietary laws even when it seemed unnecessary. When he interpreted troubling dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, he spoke truth even when it was dangerous. When the kingdom changed hands, he continued to serve with integrity, even though he could have retired, disappeared, faded into obscurity. Every small choice reinforced the pattern. Every act of obedience deepened the roots. So when the ultimate test came, when faithfulness meant facing death, Daniel didn't have to think about it. He simply kept doing what he had always done. That's the power of consistency. That's the strength of a life built on daily devotion, and it's available to anyone. Daniel was not superhuman. He was not born with extraordinary courage. He was a man who chose again and again, day after day, to trust God, to pray, to obey, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was difficult, even when it cost him everything. The question the story poses to us is not, could you survive a night with lions? The question is, are you building a life that would prepare you for that night? Are you praying when no one is watching? Are you choosing integrity when compromise would be easier? Are you trusting God in the small moments so that trust becomes instinct in the big ones? Because the truth is, most of us will never face a literal lion's den. But we will all face moments where faithfulness becomes costly, where obedience means sacrifice, where following God means swimming against the current. We'll face pressure at work to cut corners. We'll face social pressure to stay silent about our beliefs. We'll face internal pressure to prioritise comfort over conviction. We'll face 1,000 small moments where we have to choose between what's easy and what's right. And in those moments, we'll discover what we're actually made of. We'll discover whether our faith is real or just theoretical. We'll discover whether we've been building on rock or on sand. Daniel built on rock. And when the storm came, when the decree was signed, when the officials gathered, when the pit yawned open, he stood firm. Not because he was brave, but because he had spent a lifetime learning to trust. The lions couldn't touch him, not because they lacked teeth or hunger, but because something greater was present in that pit. Something sovereign, something kind, something that sees the faithfulness of those who serve in quiet devotion and does not forget. God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions, but God had been with Daniel long before that night. In the daily prayers, in the decades of service, in the countless small acts of faithfulness that no one saw. That's where miracles really happen. Not just in the dramatic moment of rescue, but in the quiet formation of a soul that's learned to trust, in the daily discipline that prepares a heart to endure, in the choice to keep praying when prayer seems pointless, to keep obeying when obedience is costly, to keep believing when everyone around you thinks you're foolish. Daniel prayed with his windows open because hiding was never an option, because he knew that faith practiced in secret, out of fear, is faith that has already begun to erode. He chose visibility, he chose consistency, he chose God, even when it cost him everything, and God honoured that choice. Not because Daniel was perfect, but because his devotion was genuine, not because he was fearless, but because he trusted something greater than fear. The lion's den is not just a story from the past, it's a symbol, a reminder, a mirror. We all face moments where faithfulness becomes inconvenient, where truth becomes costly, where integrity demands sacrifice. And in those moments, we get to choose, hide or stand, compromise or remain, bend or hold. Daniel chose to hold, and in doing so, he discovered something ancient and eternal. Even in the darkest dens, God's presence remains nearer than fear, so the question remains, not for Daniel, but for us. What do we do when faithfulness becomes dangerous? When obedience is outlawed? When following God means risking everything we've built? Do we pray with our windows open, or do we close them just to survive? Daniel's answer echoes across the centuries, and it's not complicated, it's not dramatic, it's not loud. It's simply this: keep praying, keep trusting, keep standing, even when the lions are waiting, even when the law's signed, even when everyone is watching, because God is nearer than fear, and his faithfulness never fails, even in the den.